first off, I'm Andrew Stark. I'm co-producer of Walk, Listen, Create. We're a social enterprise. We're actually registered in Belgium because we thought craftily that we could access some EU money that way. And what we try to do is we try to support artists, performers, and writers who either make work on foot or to be experienced on foot or write about walking. And Anne de Forest not only writes about walking, but she's a essayist, a poet herself, and fantastically an editor, including for our annual chapbook, which we publish following up with our writing competition that we run every year, where we encourage poets and writers to write very short pieces about walking. But this evening's event is something that Anne de Forest invented for us. It's called Walking America, Conversations with Writers. Anne has chosen the writers. This is the fourth in what we hope will be a continuing series throughout next year as well. And I'm going to hand over to Anne and say, Anne, really, this is your show. So take it away.
Well, thanks, Andrew. And thank you for responding to my idea, whenever that was, 1.5 years ago. It's been really wonderful. And we've had some great conversations. And a lot of it has been about thinking about what's distinct about, we'll say now, walking North America, as today Lisa is from Canada. And I'm also in a mode right now, as many of us are, as being mindful of American hegemony. And we actually called this one instead Walking Turtle Island, to honor the sense of the unity of the continent that is the original indigenous name for it, and the continent and its inhabitants, human and non-human and and other species. So we'll call this one Walking Turtle Island. But many interesting questions have come up about what makes walking, either as an American a writer in North America as opposed to in the UK or Europe especially, or what makes or walking the particular landscapes of North America different from walking European landscapes. So those themes have come up and have kind of reverberated throughout the conversations, and we'll see what comes out today. One thing that's interesting about Cole and Lisa is right now they are both in France, and they spend at least part of their time, and maybe Lisa full time, in France. So we can talk a little bit about being expats and what that means too, if we get to that. But first, I just want to start by introducing Cole Swensen, who is going to be our first reader. And I have to say, when I first discovered Cole, and especially first through her book On Walking On, and then subsequent books, I just, whenever I open a page, every poem makes me want to simultaneously read all the writers she refers to, or go for a walk. And Cole has been a teacher. She's published 20 collections of poetry, most recently and, which was longlisted for the Griffin Prize, a volume of critical essays, Noise That Stays Noise. Another volume, Veer, is coming out from Alice James Books in 2026. She's a former Guggenheim Fellow. She has won the Iowa Poetry Prize, the San Francisco State Poetry Center Book Award, and the National Poetry Series, and has been a finalist for the National Book Award and the LA Times Book Award. She's also a translator and has won the PEN USA Award in Translation, and is currently shortlisted for the Alta 2024 National Translation Award. She divides her time between Paris and the San Francisco Bay Area. Welcome, Cole.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for inviting us. And the good news is that translation, it was Pierre Alferi's And the Street won the Alta National Book Award. So I was really thrilled that that happened. Yeah, it was really good. I'm going to be reading from the book and On Walking On, which is about a series of writers. I started out with the question, why is there this connection between walking and writing? And there is. The number of writers who are inveterate walkers is huge. And what's the connection? And I just couldn't come up with any ideas on that. But I was reading lots and lots of writers, descriptions of walks they took, books, et cetera, et cetera. So this has 7, I think it is, series that are based on specific books written by writers. And then a whole bunch of single poems on writers who are well known for walking. So it starts with Chaucer and it ends with Lisa Robertson. So, and on the back is let's get it right. This is a line, one of Richard Long's lines and photographs. And many of you may know his line made by walking as the first walking art piece. So I'm going to start with some pieces by Lisa. And Lisa wrote a book many years ago called 7 Walks and the Office of Soft Architecture. Or is it the Office of Soft Architecture and 7 Walks? At any rate, Lisa, which is it?
Sorry, I muted myself. It has a long word, it has an overly long title. It's called Occasional Work and 7 Walks from the Office for Soft Architecture.
Thank you. It's yep. In my library in California, so I couldn't consult it today. But so I'm going to read 3 of the 7 walks. And what I don't use language from other people's work, but I use a lot of imagery and other hints that come out of people's descriptions. So 7 walks, Lisa Robertson. The first walk. We are guided, we are we, foxed and shaded, sliding over the surface of civilization, which is reading behind us or reading inside us, is a civil contract shattering in its choices. There is the styrofoam cup and the paradise that is likely not quite ready for us, crushed. The petal in the hand that disappeared within. The petal was another one, it undid, and then one again, one pale room over the market turning pink. It's early in the rhythm of the theater of the soon. We walked the vowel into an archive through windows rent apparent by bombing, early morning. Light can seem to strike light in a spear that breaks, but we are used to the broken and so built a library. The second walk. And thanking memory, we spent every afternoon in a park, hiding a different century, my guide with the endless peaches, and then suddenly a fig. Suddenly threw our class affiliations into striking relief and disappearing to everyone but ourselves, we let time slide through us. You cannot deny, we felt hands too dragging through our own, leaving empty. We were not alone. There were the many rooms, and through them moved another 100 years. My guide continually suggesting that any rain makes yet another smaller room for us. And this too will refuse to vanish at the least, and asks of what are we the medium, and can we haul behind us this minor fountain, this gallery after gallery of reflective glass in which falling water takes part, taking apart the faces, for instance, ours, pressed against the panes of a greenhouse, trying to put a name to the living there. And by the way, the guide is a dog. The seventh walk. What is a gift? Several unfurling speech, each suggesting. Suddenly, it is we who are the many and collecting, arranging images in the strange interior, inside of which we were strangers, oddly resembling our pictures. In the wake of reflective surfaces, we considered at Jet, his life in gesture. We translated the gestures and there found an intimate city, our founded city in a slippage slipping among its documents. This was our intention, and carefully. Someone leaned down to touch the street with the tip of a finger, recording the operative colors, sea gray, cypress shadow, charcoal green, blending forward, almost breathless. In fact, we walked so long that the park came back. Mint violet, my widow, smoke hazel, my queen. We are, we, and in ourselves these documents and seek, curling up on a park bench in the walking dark and walking on in certain words. And I'm going to flip back to the beginning of the book and one piece in the series on Thoreau's solitary walks. There's a visceral relationship between the pace at which you walk and that at which you write, as if a line of stones edged the road, seeming accidental and accidentally even, the spine of a ridge equally incident in its perfect alignment with the line of the road itself. Walking alone the few hours each day that he could spare for that occupation, saying, I am crushed in man and on this dust. His last yes was a detailed list of everything he saw living along the way. The distance became an imperative, though as he grew older, displacement tends a gentleman who confused his face with something seen or almost seen in a forest, or only glimpsed and barely, with the sun always beside you, always walking. And this is a very well-known writer, Walker Wordsworth. Dorothy walking from Kendal to Grasmere and Grasmere to Keswick, a mere 33 miles, from Alfoxden to Lynmouth and back again for the sake of a landscape, an internal painting, refining in brushstrokes a new form of breathing. She could breathe again and wrote it up notational. March 30, walked I know not where. March 31, walked. April 1, walked by moonlight, walked till blind, walked by wind, walked into time. April 2, walked under trees. April 4, walked to the sea, a great commotion in the air. Hunkered woman, dove-shaped as the hand takes on the size and shape of a bird across the pages of a journal, walked in twilight, walked inside, and was neither heard nor herded, though I sensed the gathering forces trying to gather up all the indeterminate group of all things headed forward. I will sort them. And this is a couple on Virginia Woolf's essay, Street Haunting, which is another series in the book. If shadows come in groves, Virginia Woolf preferred London in the dark of an afternoon whose pale islands move from lamp to lamp, anonymous beneath, and then a grove of sun, slanting to the last, as if in walking on, a tribe of them was made. Woolf liked the silence of the hurrying forms, hurrying home, dressed in cold. As a city, all is surface, or a succession of surfaces that change texture and color, all its grays upon a gray, filtered in shadow, amber to a window, climbing as does the gaze that caught above the trees a window's other lights, and these, as if we, turning over or around a slower hour, held the hour back. Lamps, by which we are released, as by the dark we sign away a certain hold that held us toward or left untried, we catalog the many kinds of light. One surrounds a warmth that turns into a face as a face glides through its pool, and other streetlights white, like those that cut across Green Park, deepening in the dusk. In Wolfe's day, they would have been lit by a lamplighter who rode up on a bicycle with a ladder over his arm. He leaned it against the lamppost, climbed up, turned a valve, and moved on to the next, and so on, until suddenly he turns off the path and cuts across the grass, bicycling away through the dark. And I'm going to switch to another sort of poem that's in the book, and these are walks that I took in Paris at night, and just I would kind of just keep an eye out for anything odd that occurred. And as soon as I started paying attention to anything odd that occurred, it turns out there's always something odd occurring. So it was a really fun. Mine to work. The walk of least resistance. You start with a single premise. For instance, turn left. And then you set out in a straight line and engage the constraint, turn left, only and whenever a blockage occurs. A red light, a T intersection, impenetrable crowds, a river, barbed wire, a dog standing guard. Sometimes you go straight for miles, while at other times you seem to go around in circles to the left. I also had a whole series of prescribed walks. A walk on June 21. Walking down a long, quiet street in the dark, thinking that this is the shortest night of the year. For a while, my footsteps are the only sound I hear until I pick up something going on somewhere up ahead. The noise grows louder and soon is clearly a party in full swing, clearly coming from a building down the block, which I soon pass and notice that, despite all the noise, every window in it is dark. A walk on July 13. The eve of a major holiday, so everything is very busy, very loud, with people absolutely everywhere, some of them literally dancing in the streets. It's really quite nice. I turn into a particularly busy street, no cars, and there's no room for them, but down which a young couple is trying to negotiate a stroller in which sits a very miserable little girl, maybe 3, crying her eyes out and clutching a cat, a very patient cat, which she brushes across her eyes to dry her tears and then goes on crying while the cat stares straight ahead. And the last one is a walk on July 19. Hot out tonight, so everyone is leaning out their windows, sometimes in twos, talking, sometimes alone, watching. So much passing on the street. For instance, my attention is caught by a young woman leaning over a toddler in a stroller, coaxing her, trying to get her to stop fussing, which she's doing by making elaborate sweeping gestures, which do, in fact, distract her. When a sharp voice from above makes me look up and realize that these gestures are meant as much or more for an old woman, a classic in her wizened visage and crone-like countenance, leaning out of a second-floor window, who, once she's got the mother's attention, says clearly, even sharply, but not unkindly, "Don't forget to bring me back the real one." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cole. It was so great to hear these, not just see them on the page. It's always such a pleasure to hear how the writer reads the poem. And I was thinking of that as well with Lisa. I'm so excited to hear her read because her poems have really insinuated, I mean, her essay, poem-like essays have insinuated themselves into my head in a certain way, a certain sonic way. And I'm really curious to see how that matches, whether there's a match or not, or whether it will be a different sort of cadence and syncopation. And I advise all of you, I know some of you, I don't know if any of you saw that Cole's work was, you could follow it on the page. And if you did, there's it's interesting to look at how she uses line space and line breaks in her poems. Lisa, we're not going to read, and I advise you all to close your eyes and listen to Lisa, because the image conjured in your head will be a rich one, I think. That's for me. So I think it would be interesting to listen with your eyes closed. I also love, as I said earlier, that we had this bridge where the first works that Cole read are in response to 7 Walks from the Office for Soft Architecture. And I think Lisa is going to read from that as well. So let me introduce Lisa. She is from Vancouver originally, a Canadian writer currently living in France, poet, essayist, novelist, and her books include the essay collection, Occasional Works, and 7 Walks from the Office for Soft Architecture, and the novel, the Baudelaire Fractal. And I think she's going to read selections from both.
I am.
So welcome. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks. I should just say that the texts that I'll read from each of the two books you mentioned are they're set as prose on the page. So there's no line breaking going on at all. And it's a pleasure to share this time with you and with Cole, who has become a dear friend since over the time that we've both been living in France. And I think that there are more and more bridges across our work back and forth. Definitely, there are more and more dog walks involved in our shared time. I'm going to begin by reading the briefest walk from the Office for Soft Architecture, fourth walk. The sky over the defunct light industrial district was still the sky, less sublime, but more articulate. And walking, what we witnessed was like a flickering appetite, the real end of sunlight, buildings torn out of the earth and forgotten, the superabundant likenesses of pictured products collapsed into our dream, and over in the dark, the flickering appetite now bunched under the ribs. We were partly in another place. It's hard not to disappear. I pondered this ritual of crisis and form as my guide and I walked the unprofitable time of the city, the pools of slowness, the lost parts. We breached the city's principle at every moment with our incommensurate yearnings and in the quasi-randomness of our route. Ruined factories rising into fog, their lapsed symmetries nearly Gothic. The abandoned undulations of the vast mercantile storage facilities, the avenues of these, sooty, Roman, blunt, and down below the clapboard family houses with little triangular porticos, lesser temples in the scheme, but as degraded. And in these rough and farcical mirrors, the struggle to recognize a city. By a habitual process of transubstantiation, some of this struggle was named the heart. But we wanted the heart to mean something other than this interminable Roman metronome of failed eros and placation, something more like the surging modifications of the inventive sky. So we attempted to notice the economies that could not appear in money. Vast aluminum light sliding over the sea-like lake, the stacks of disposable portable buildings labeled women and men, decayed orchards gone oblique between parking lots, and the complex grainy scent that pervaded the street. As we walked, we presented one another with looted images, tying them with great delicacy to our mortal memories and hopes. It was as if at that hour we became strands of attention that spoke. In this way, we tethered our separate mortalities to a single immutable surface. This was description or love. We must live as if this illusion is our freedom, said my guide. Freed, we moved into the anxious pause pressing forward, that pause shown to us in its detailed itinerancy by every failing surface, every bland or lurid image, each incapable caress. The world was leaning on us, leaning and budding and scraping, as if it too was subjected to strange rules never made explicit. So that was the Office for Soft Architecture's fourth walk. And just to give a tiny description of that, it's not describing one single place or site. It's rather a synthesis of sites. And I was very interested in the neighborhoods of disused grain elevators. And Those are neighborhoods that are shared by both the city of Buffalo, where I sometimes visit because of the poetics program at SUNY Buffalo, and the city of Vancouver, which is the terminus of the railroad that brings the grain from the prairies to the West Coast. So that walk was a sort of synthesis of those two lapsed industrial districts of very different cities. I'm going to read a piece now from my novel, The Baudelaire Fractal. This is set in the 1980s in Paris. And the walk that I'll read from is a walk indoors within the vast art museum art gallery called the Louvre. This season was now midwinter. Preoccupied as I was with painting, when I crossed the river during my dissolute walks, I didn't pass by the Louvre without entering. By preference, I went late in the day. Unlike my chilly maid's room, it was warm in the museum, and I relished the quietness of the galleries. For a scant few, just those of the currently agreed upon masterpieces were typically frequented. The wide upholstered benches, the subtle camaraderie of the uniformed attendants, the mysterious, enticing glimpses afforded by the elegant enfilade of room into room, the dull glow of the heavy gilt frames, the thrum of building systems, the lesser rhythm of the underdetermined and precise descriptive labels that I loved to list in my notebook. All this initiated me into a drifting euphoria. It was rather like the solipsistic pleasure of very slowly skimming a book in late afternoon without truly reading, enjoying the pleasure of turning the pages and moving the eyes across print, reveling in its mute materiality without bothering about the intricacies of meaning. I could read Latin this way. For a long time, it was the way I read French. Painting, too, was an opaque language. Here, the idea of elsewhere achieved a charged materiality. What some people experienced in crowds, amongst strange faces, on boulevards or in department stores, and this is what Poe had written of, the calm yet inquisitive interest in everything without differentiation, seized me in these long galleries of paintings. Many I glimpsed only in passing, if I were searching out a single gallery or era and became a little lost in the sprawling wings of the long building. But even the inattentive, hurried passage could present an unsought but essential encounter in the way that a single unknown face can urgently address one with its depths of attractive strangeness when passing in a crowd. This elsewhere of faces, of paintings, of pages seems to break open time, which is the punctum I searched for among the surfaces. I mean, there's an unbeckoned flash of limitlessness that can open for an instant within the propriety of the human face or the painted tableau, within this stain. This is different than the often promoted shock of newness. The intimacy of this limitlessness floods the discretion of the present, the way long familiarity with a lover's face, for example, or with a city or a room, can transform the well-known features in their beloved relations into a landscape that opens to all possible sentiments and their extremes. This in a momentary shimmering. The same inflection can happen in a painting. A minor mark or shadow on a loved surface all at once becomes the key to a completely altered understanding of an image. The contours of that otherness describe a passage, not towards fixity or in any kind of firm, locatable meaning, but towards all the potentials of admixture, the sensual forgetting of the name, all of the previously unrealizable futures that can flicker in a glance. It was early evening now, not long from closing, the time when the museum attendants, dressed in their tailored black suits, grouping themselves first in pairs, then gradually in more numbered clusters, speaking quietly amongst themselves, moving still slowly, but with a gathering purposefulness, begin to usher we lingerers towards the distant exit. I adored this transition. My pace quickened slightly, almost matching theirs, yet pointedly loitering a little before this image and that, with a minor disobedience that they too seemed to enjoy and even encourage with their glances. I felt a vibration of excitement. Soon I would stroll from the cushioned silence of the museum into the cool, busy evening. I would pause outside of several warmly lit cafes without entering, scanning for a small empty table. I would continue to the Latin Quarter without choosing any cafe at all. The river beneath the bridge would darken, splendid. I felt like De Quincey seeking some northwest passage through the naughty alleys of London, suddenly finding himself on a narrow footpath through a man's kitchen. The motion of time in this intermediate zone called evening filled me with humming expectation and ripe perplexities. I wanted to both slow and expand the moment as I walked through the long galleries with their seductive antechambers, now swiftly, now haltingly, as if searching for a landmark.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I was thinking, I was thinking of starting with a certain question, but that reading made me think about another question that maybe is a little more abstract. But I was struck reading both your work about walking, the interiority of walking and the interiorization of walking. And of course here, Lisa, you just had this, I think we think when we think about walking and writing about walking, it's often, you're walking outdoors, you're out in the fresh air, you're relating to nature in some way, or you're a flaneur in the city and you're having city walks. But this idea of places that one walks that are on the inside and what those walks do, a museum being one, an airport being one. I mean, there's so many places that come to mind that we walk without thinking, oh, we're walking. So I was struck by, but I was also struck by the way that we make any experience interior, like bring into our minds, but also kind of create of the space around us something that's like an interior, even though it's exterior world. So that's a fairly abstract thought, but I was curious what you think about that, and if that's something that strikes you as well as you're writing about the relationship between the interior mind, interior space, exterior space, and how do you write that?
Well, I would like to begin by answering using a wonderful passage I just copied out from Cole's book when I was rereading yesterday, which is this. Cole wrote, I'm not sure what text this was in, Cole, my notes are dodgy. When landscape is internalized, it carries all its varied histories inside with it. What is that from the George Sand text, maybe, Cole?
It could have been, yeah.
Yeah, it's on a file card where I've got several passages from your George Sand text, all of which are totally relevant, but we'll stick with this one for the moment. Yeah, it seems like there's not so much a sort of dialectic of inside and outside as a blurring and a sort of nesting in different scales. I mean, walking as writers and writing as walkers, we're accompanied by many other texts. So the interior life of those texts is unevenly living its own life, as we're also noticing and tracing the events of landscape or urban landscape, not all of which is completely conscious. So that's not exactly an answer to your question, but it's an observation maybe of why these shifts between inside and outside are interesting, and why the idea of nature as some sort of unadulterated site or place usually gets complicated by any walking process, by what we already know, by what we've learned, by history of representation, and by, even industrial histories, etc., that are economies that are inflecting a site or a place.
Yeah. Cole, do you have anything?
I'd like to approach it a really different way, and which also won't answer the question, but and that's when I was reading all of these texts in a very short time by lots of writers who are walking. I was struck by the fact that there are interior walkers and exterior walkers, and Rousseau, for instance, was the epitome of the internal walker, interior walker. As he walked, it allowed him to walk through his psyche, through his irritations, often through the various things going on in his life. We usually had no idea what was going on in the world around him. His walk was a matter of, again, walking inside. Whereas, and George Sand would always struck me as the epitome of the opposite, an external walker. She's always walking away from herself, out into the world. You're always aware of what things look like, what she's thinking about them too, but what things look like. So that idea that some, and I think most of us take both kinds of walks, depending on what's going on but I've always felt like walking is an externalizing activity for many people too. It is a way of getting, even if you do it inside. I'm thinking about the museum's a great example. You're getting outside of yourself through the paintings, through the sculptures, and even though you're walking inside, technically.
One of the things I noticed, I was just sort of reskimming Rousseau's Reveries of a Solitary Walker as opposed to rereading it. But I completely agree with you that he's a very interior walker in terms of exploring sentimental and psychological space. But there's a way in which the social and the outer world intrudes almost in a form of slapstick. Like I was reading in the Seventh Walk, where he's in the mountains in Switzerland, and he's describing the forest, and it's this kind of primordial experience of deep shade and fallen trees and et cetera, and he's having a sublime experience in the forest, and suddenly he hears a sort of metrical ticking sound, and he thinks, what the heck is that? And he kind of rounds it up into a clearing, and he sees he's beside a stocking factory. And he's like, well, only in Switzerland would there be a stocking factory in the middle of the forested mountains. But this does happen there's only the one stocking factory in his walks, but there are like kids who won't leave him alone when he's trying to have deep thoughts, and he's always stumbling. So the world's kind of banging into him.
And literally, is it in the second walk where he gets hit by the dog?
Yeah.
Which is this really dramatic, and it's making me think about he, in an exaggerated way, but that it's all about encounter. A walk is always about encounter.
Yeah.
And Rousseau, being a somewhat larger than life exaggerated person, just had to do it in a larger than life way. And this dog races into him and knocks him
It's
flat.
a dog that's pulling a cart. I think that was a mode of, you know, transporting stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
and he got knocked unconscious by this dog.
That's pretty, I think that the
But
comic aspect of it is also, I think that idea of being, I mean, the element of surprise in walking is something that's always striking. And I think both of you have that in your work. It's like what does surprise? And a surprise can be horrifying or it can be comic, but the surprise has that element of what, I mean, what Cole said earlier of that what did you say? I was going out looking for something odd. I was looking for something odd, and then you realize that something odd is always there. What's so that
Mm.
that aspect of walking as being sort of open to the odd.
yeah. Yeah. And again, in encountering it, and I'm really fascinated by the notion of encounter and what we mean by that, the way that it engages participation. And I think walking is great for that, because in a sense, walking is always participating in the world rather than standing and looking at it, because you're moving through it. It's a penetrating the world, and it encourages a kind of encounter that is an even exchange between objects and person, between other animals and person, between other people.
Mm. Yeah, I like that. That I was curious, I wanted for both of you to talk about in your own work what the relationship between walking and writing is, not just as content or subject matter, but as practice. Is walking part of your creative practice? And how do the two practices inform one another?
Um, for me, it's differed at different points in my writing life. I I came across this idea of walking as a literary genre um, only in the late 90s, I think. And actually via Rousseau. And I started to read Rousseau because I had visited Ian Hamilton Finlay, the landscape gardener and poet at his garden um, outside of Edinburgh. And I took a lot of pictures, and my plan had been to do a slide lecture back in Vancouver. But in the course of visiting his garden and happily discussing with him his work there, I realized that I had no business saying anything about Finlay's work until I'd read Rousseau, who was core to Finlay. So that sent me on a Rousseau mission, which, you know, kind of became everything else. And so I read the Confessions first, and then some of the political essays and stuff. And then I came across this wonderful Reveries of a Solitary Walker, which then plunged me into this whole romantic genre of walking. And this was happening at a time in Vancouver, where I was living then, when the city was really, really quickly changing because of out of control real estate investment and development, and buildings being torn down and rebuilt at just an astonishing rate. And I became interested in trying to find a way to document sites in the city that were disappearing. And around that time, I adopted my first dog. So I found myself walking in sort of rougher areas of the city than I would have on my own, partially because the dog gave me courage. He was a big, quite a large dog, and partially because he was kind of not super well trained. So I had to go to places, out of the way places, where he could have some freedom without bothering people or without getting injured or anything. So all of those things kind of came together, and suddenly I was in this world of walking texts, which resulted in this soft architecture book that came out in 2003, which is partially documenting Vancouver, but within a larger, like Vancouver urban history, but within a larger context of walking texts and modernism and the intersection of capitalist economies with urban sites. So, and since then, it sort of has come into my work in different ways at different times. Probably most markedly in the Baudelaire Fractal, because it's very involved in different literary tropes that come out of Baudelaire's work, including the flaneur, the sort of spaced out drifter through the urban landscape, but trying to occupy that perspective from the specific point of view of a young girl in her early 20s.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it surfaces and recedes in different ways at different times.
So it's like you're always walking and you're always writing, and sometimes the two sort of conjoin in a
Yeah, I mean, at very least, taking my, usually daily walk with my dog is a great time if I'm not writing about walking or consciously using this as a genre, just a way to reflect on my day's work. And
Mhm.
I never do walk without a notebook.
Mm.
Because something will cross my mind or cross my field of vision.
Well, that's a good practical thing. My notebooks tend to get all messy and wet, and so I've discovered notes on the phone, which has also been a saver. Well, what about you, Cole? What's the relationship in the practices?
Yeah. I'm sort of not sure that there is one really. If I didn't write, I think I'd certainly still walk, and if I didn't walk, I'd still be writing. And I ended up doing that book because I was interested in the fact that so many writers are also walkers, and was thinking about things like rhythms. I mean, that's a really sort of obvious one, but walking is so rhythm driven. And so whether there's an underground connection, I love rhythm in my work. I love putting rhythm in the work. And so maybe I'm attracted to both the form of poetry and the act of walking because of an enjoyment of rhythm. And I too always have a notebook with me. But also lately I've been walking a lot, listening to books, audible books. And
Mm.
so that destroys any chance of another idea coming through your head. But that said, ideas do come, and I'll jot them down, but it's maybe not as intentional a connection.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because I was thinking my next question really was sort of prompted by your own book, but this idea of how we walk. We're always carrying other people's words with us if we're readers, and your book really brought that home. But Lisa has references in hers that I was just thinking, like, how do we? That's part of who we are too. We're walkers, we're writers, we're readers, and there are always these people that kind of coexist with us. And in some cases, I mean, I like in the Baudelaire Fractal, it's almost literally start inhabiting you. It feels like that's taking that to a higher degree, that sense of someone accompanying you as you walk. And it sometimes makes funny juxtapositions, I think, of like I was just in India, and I was starting, like, the people who were in my head were like Thoreau, Emerson. I mean, those are, you bring your culture with you. Wendell Berry. I mean, it was just like funny what gets stirred up, even if you're in a different landscape. And so I was curious how, who are the writers who you carry with you, or you feel are in your head as you're walking, not just in the audible microphone.
That's an interesting. You're mentioning Thoreau and Emerson in particular. Makes me think about ethics in relation to walking and writing. And I was thinking about the way in which the people I found myself focusing on were people who had a particular connection, perhaps not mentioned overtly, but to ethics and to considerations of ethical living. And I was thinking Sebald, and you know, lots of other people who are mentioned, Blake. Yeah, so I just to throw that into the mix as well.
Yeah, there's an ethics of walking, and that, yeah, there's an idea of them thinking ethically, that there's a way of
And
this
and that
relationship.
maybe ethics is a bridge
Yes,
between
yeah.
walking and writing, a kind of not specific, but an activated and enacted ethics.
Mm-hmm.
That many of the writers that I found myself drawn to work out in their writing.
That's what, Lisa, do you have any thoughts on that, or on writers that you carry with you or accompany you?
I read so eclectically that I do lack fidelity in in my sort of inner textual references, but I do seem to come back quite often to Rousseau, to Reveries of a Solitary Walker, but also to the Virginia Woolf text, which Cole has written in response to Street Haunting. And I actually wrote an essay recently for a visual artist named Vera Cox that refers to that Virginia Woolf text, but not vis-a-vis walking. What I sort of what became fresh to me when I reread that essay very recently was not so much the passage through the streets at dusk in London, but the interiors of the shops she was visiting, because quite often she's inside in this in this text, and particularly there's a very long passage where she's inside a bookshop, and there are just miraculous descriptions of dust, the dusty books and the dusty floor and the rolling dust like a Homeric sea, and it becomes this big meditation on dust. So I think that the texts I return to, that's why I never listen to talking books when I walk, because I can't keep headphones in my ears. They spontaneously erupt from my ears. Anyways, there's writers like Woolf or Rousseau have extremely mysterious metaphorical relationships to their environments. And sometimes that relationship can be comedic, as I find it often is in Rousseau, and sometimes more sort of elemental or cosmic, even, as you can find in Woolf. But I'm really, really interested in this idea of ethics that Cole is invoking, because it's not something I've explicitly thought through, but I sure feel like I want to be doing that now. So I'd almost like to invite Cole to say more about that.
Cole?
Yeah, sure. And one thing I wanted to just comment on briefly with the Virginia Woolf essay is there's also times in that essay where she's looking into windows, and some of those windows are private. And so I was thinking back to your first question, Anne, about inside, outside, and that weird way that through walking, you are outside, but you're looking inside, and you're passing different interiors. You're visiting all of these different insides. And I just thought it's a really interesting moment in that essay, a way of being inside while also being outside, and also then having a private sort of issue with public and private, and making
Yes.
the, the private public, but even more subtly making the public private in a way.
Yeah, and also about go ahead, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, just by looking into a private space, you bring that privacy out into the street and make that public space a little, in its own way, private.
Yes, and there's this also related to that is yeah, there's the voyeur, that you're looking inside to this other life that isn't yours, and the weird solitude of being out in a crowd. Lisa, I wrote down a quote of yours that now I can't find about that's really about how the being solitary, you're solitary, you separate yourself from other humans, that tendency when you're out in a crowd, that, you're in your own head, you're in your own space, and you're not always a part of the humanity. And that looking from outside in has that as well. And again, especially walking at night. Night is
Yeah.
that's in your poems, Cole, the city, summer walks in Paris, that there's all this outdoor life, but there's also indoor life that you're experiencing as well, moving through it.
Could I just say something else, Cole, about your Georges Sand sequence? Now, I wrote this not sure exactly whether it's a citation or not from your poem, but I believe it is. I believe that you say the contemporary argument between realism and romanticism in literature. So you refer to this argument in relationship to Georges Sand's work. But I'm bringing this up now because it seems to have very much to do with ethics. And it seems to have very much to do with our contemporary moment politically. So Georges Sand replies to this argument, the argument between realism and romanticism. And this is a quote: "I do not find my prejudices more or less accurate than your own."
That's a great.
And I absolutely adore that. And that sort of distribution of value among an extremely varied okay, so I just hear I'm just seeing somebody's little note popping up. Dawn says, what was the quote? "I do not find my prejudices more or less accurate than your own."
But I have to say,
yep.
It's not a quote.
Okay.
I invented it and put it in her mouth.
Okay. Can you say more about that then?
Yeah, she was getting a lot of flack for some of her stances in writing, and she stood her ground. And I read a lot of biography of her biography is like this, but I read lots of it, and that's where I gleaned most of that from, rather than from her the walking book. But yeah, this idea that there was, this argument going on at the time, and people would accuse her of kind of polishing up, cutifying country life and romanticizing the plight of the peasant, etc. And it seemed to me that she felt, that she would have felt from all of her writing that yeah, I look at it this way, but you have things you're looking at that I equally find, prejudicial. That the way that anyone looks at any, certain things in particular, but we all have our prejudices, often unrecognized preconceptions, and that her way of standing her ground would have, I imagined, included that sentiment. So
I just found another one, looking to see where that was, and I just now we're at this theme of of ethics and stance. And you have this other wonderful line, which is also probably your quote. It is my job to be a stranger, and I repeat the words vast and immense in order to remain so, which gets at something.
Yeah, there was in this book, and which I'll get the name of, but there's a really interesting intimacy distance activity going on. She's in this village. She never mentions the name. She goes back to it several times, often with friends, and she has a really compassionate sort of gaze at the village and at the people in it, but at the same time she keeps her distance. And I just found that a really interesting sort of approach, to be both intimate and distant at the same time. And I just remembered there's a list of the books in here, and that one is Promenade autour d'un village, and it hasn't been translated into English, but
Hmm.
One of the things I'm thinking about that distance, Cole, is how much of the distance is more or less imposed by a huge class difference between Georges Sand, who was, very upper class, really,
Yeah.
and basically the agricultural workers and similar who generally populate villages in this region.
It's interesting. And one of the things I really liked about the book was this feeling that her distance is a gesture of respect,
Yeah.
of not presuming
Mhm.
to be able to easily enter into these people's lives,
Right.
and yet also having this really, loving and affectionate eye toward them. So it was, and
Mhm.
again, it seemed to me that, thinking of ethics in the sense of considering the treatment, the correct treatment of others, that she very much, that's something that's going on
Mhm.
in her mind at the
Mhm.
same time.
The idea of, to me, it struck me that the stranger, it's almost it's a humble role to take on, to be the stranger, as opposed to an arrogant one. That,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I
it's,
think
we
it's
have a good question about ethics from the audience. You ready? So I don't know, Cole, sorry, there's something about the sound. If you were saying more, I didn't mean to cut you off.
no.
So Jeff Jones says, here's a big one talking of ethics. Does the political backdrop mood of a country impact the walker writer, or can we insulate ourselves from, say, the bigger backdrop? And I don't know if, Jeff, you want to say more about that, or just have that be what, go ahead and see what Lisa and Cole have to say to that.
I'm just going to say one thing very quickly to start out, is that there's a way in which I think walking is always walking away. It's always also walking toward, but sometimes the walking away is more pronounced, sometimes the walking toward. And I think in politically tense and unfortunate moments, maybe many of us, without thinking of it consciously, are walking away, are using walking as a symbolic way of walking away.
Walking away from the political, you mean?
No, walking away from a given specific situation.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
using walking as a political act
Right.
to
Okay.
refuse
Yeah.
a certain situation.
I see.
And in
I see.
other circumstances, using walking as a political act to walk toward. I think that's absolutely. And so that idea that, is walking in some way, does it always have a political element, a political shade, political shading? I think it's like so many things. I could argue it either way, but I think it often does have a political element to it.
I think that one of the things that walking can offer us as people who are in and sometimes very unhappily or angrily in very compromised political conditions and times, is a kind of a different kind of reflective space, the kind of inner reflection that can go on when you're moving through an actual world, as opposed to gazing at a screen or, you know, being in your interior space of whatever kind it is, and with whomever you share that space with. That the kind of inner reflection that you can bring to political experience during just by getting out, whether that's if you're in the countryside in whatever the agricultural landscape is, which is never wilderness, never pure nature. You're entering an economy basically when you walk, and you're experiencing it through the body. And you're experiencing it often in ways that you don't want to be experiencing it. Like I live in the countryside in France, and that sounds to lots of people really idyllic. But one of my big problems walking is avoiding crop sprayers, because I don't want to breathe that stuff because it's actually carcinogenic, you know, and I don't want my dog to breathe it. So when I see one of those things in the distance, you know, I'm going in the opposite way. So, you know, you're not going out and walking in order to escape a political economy. You're encountering it differently, and you're learning something about the sites and the participants in that political economy, and you're learning it through a reflective movement among it, not over it, not, you know, you're not at a distance from it. You're, you know, you're in the nitty gritty of details.
Yeah.
I was thinking too of, you know, your mention of, and you're experiencing it bodily, is making me think it's a way of making the political kinetic also.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
brings it into the body in a gestural kinetic way that I think is a very, very important mode of feeling. You know, we're used to thinking of feeling as, you know, touching, and we feel with our skin, but we feel deeply, deeply every movement that we make. And so to bring the political into the kinetic, I think is an important thing that's going on there.
Yeah, I think related to that is the effect of moving, you know, not being in a vehicle, you know, with glass being the screen between us and the world and moving through it. I was thinking, Lisa, about what you said about the grain elevators, you know, walking in these landscapes that people don't always see, or if they see, they're bypassing them. And there's something about, to me, there's something about that knowledge, or bringing that knowledge of a place, and it's what you're calling its economies, but it's kind of infrastructure and ecosystems that you experience by walking from them. And I love the thing that you said about, you know, Rousseau and the stocking factory, because to me that sounds so contemporary in a way, that you can be out in the, you know, it's sort of like you and the crop dusters. I mean, that you're in something that feels idyllic, but we live in this particular climate and world, so that we have to sort of witness all the time. I was looking at the beginning of the essay book, that Lisa, that says the Office for Soft Architecture came into being as I watched the city of Vancouver dissolve in the fluid called money. And I feel like that's almost an answer to Jeff's question in and of itself, that you're seeing this happening and that you feel like you have to go out and witness it and maybe document it. Anybody else have any questions? I want to open it up to the audience. We have about 15 minutes or so if there's time to ask questions.
I just wanted to say that you're mentioning of the car, and Lisa, you're evoking, you know, going out, that walking is also a matter of stripping away a bunch of protective layering that we get from our houses, from our cars, from the bus, from, and you're sort of face to face with something. The other thing I wanted to mention too, I've always been fascinated by the pace of perception that walking imposes. And you'll see something up in the distance and think, what is that? And you cannot get there faster. If you're in a car, as soon as you ask the question, you've answered it. If you're a jogger, I'm sure you get there a lot faster too. But I'll frequently find that and just think, I have to wait. My perceptive capacity is determined by my walking pace. And I love that
Well, I
kind
love
of
that.
unveiling of what you don't understand at a distance, and how the unveiling is slow because of
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
one of the walkers whose work I love to read is the English Romantic poet John Clare, and he, of course, has this fabulous text called The Journey from Essex, where he's escaping a mental institution he's been incarcerated in. But that happens at the end of his life. And his earlier texts describe the landscape, the landscape that was undergoing enclosure by forces of capital. From the point of view of a laborer, he would literally, just get work digging in fields. And the critic John Barrell talks about John Clare's work in terms of foreground. And he says that what we get in Clare is a world that we don't look over the world as we might look over a landscape in a painting, or in from certain class positions we might look into a distance, but we're always in the foreground where the activity is happening. We never leave the foreground. And so this is something that's specific to Clare, that has to do with his forms of labor in landscapes, in fields. But it seems to extend itself as one of the possibilities or modes of pacing in walking, as a way of participating in a social and natural and economic world. We're constantly whatever our sort of idealizing notion of distances and views over, and the ethics that pertain to overviews might be, we're thrown repeatedly into a foreground where the details are often obscure. And we can't explain the foreground according to a superstructure. We can only describe a foreground in terms of the material actions that are happening in it. And that's something that I really relate to when I'm out walking. I mean, whatever grand ideas might have actually got me out there. I mean, apart from just the need to walk the dog, or try to, like everybody, I've got those step counter things in my phone now, and so we're all trying to do 10,000. God. Whatever the sort of big picture is that might get you out there, once you're out there, something different is happening. And it's all happening in the foreground. And it requires you to suspend your imposed notions and simply notice. Simply absorb, notice, and sometimes it's not even a matter of trying to understand. It's a matter of being present with. And I do believe that is an ethical, could be construed as an ethical position.
Oh, definitely. I would say that. I've done these walks that I have this prompt sometimes for myself or sometimes for other people, which are walk as if you're the least significant being in the landscape and where you're going.
Yeah, that's great.
That because it's hard. We're not trained to do that. As we said, I like that idea of foregrounding. We have a question from Anthony about walking, but I wanted to say one quick thing about pace, because I felt like what Cole said about pace and walking to me also applies to poetry. And I think poetry is a way that also sort of has that that slows things down or opens things up. I mean, it can speed things up, but there's also that as a reader, when you're a reader of poetry, there's that in really good, the best poems, I would say, there is that dawning of perception that happens. It's not given to you right away. So I don't know if you see that as a relationship between walking and poetry and the pace of poetry, either of you.
I hadn't thought of it, but I think it's a really great, excellent connection to make between the two. You can skim a newspaper article or a prose piece, but you can't skim a poem. It just doesn't work. And so that seems to me to be an excellent echo of the fact that you have to have the patience and wait.
Yeah, and the poet can set the pace, help you set the pace too.
Yeah. I had wanted to ask you, Lisa, because this switch, I don't want to say switch from poetry to prose or novel, but the Baudelaire Fractal does have a shape that's different from everything else, or much of everything else you've done. And I wondered about narrative and walking, and whether walking, I was thinking about how the book is implicitly, not only with the Baudelaire mentioned and all the dandyism, and but the book is constantly just walking through Paris, walking around a hotel room. It's just always in motion, and whether the that theme and its prominence in this book might have informed this genre modification.
Well, I haven't switched from writing poetry to writing novels. I'm always doing lyric things. Whatever. I'm, translating some troubadour poems or making little verses in my notebook pages or whatever. So I just I think you already know that, Cole, but I just did want to make that clear, that I haven't sort of abandoned poetry for writing prose. But I mean, one of the things that interests me about constructing a novel and working with narrative, as opposed to, for most of my publishing life, I've written essayistic prose. But that's very different than I've discovered than writing narrative prose, because the problem in narrative is time and how to represent different scales or experiences or modes of time within a single narration. So whether that is, you've got a narrator who's loosely speaking from the perspective of the present, but speaking of a time in her fictional youth, or whether you have various characters who have different temporal experiences, or whether the narration of the novel is sort of taking place in the path of a previously narrated place, a place that perhaps Baudelaire or Rousseau has already narrated. So there's a doubling. So that's what's become interesting to me. That's is why I'm writing a second novel, which as you know, I'm doing. because the problematics of the representation of time are deeply puzzling to me and stimulate me to, want to try different ways of getting that through. So yeah, it is very, I'm not saying time does not exist in the poem, but it exists very differently. And generally it's not a narrated time. It's a more experiential time maybe, or it's time indicated or represented by means of image, or by means of syntactic cut or breach or caesura. There's a lot more fragmentation that creates temporal effects in a positive way. But narration for me has never been a problem in poetry. So yeah, and for me, what narration is it's just repeating myself, but is bringing into relationship different temporalities into the same grammatical movement.
Oh, I like that definition. I want to, we're sort of speaking of time, it's time, I think, to come to an end, and I could just keep talking. This is really fascinating, and I always feel like in these Zoom things that I would love to just go out afterwards and have a beer or something and just keep the conversation going for those who wanted to.
I want to apologize because I realized I cut off somebody's question.
Well, there's one question left there's one in the text here. Anthony asked about walking. This is a good place to end. Is sort of where is there a place in particular you'd like to walk in next? I like that. Do you want to say anything more about that, Anthony? Or phrase it with your voice? Or
I know that so much comes from the environment in which one is. And I was really intrigued that your discussion of ethics did not bring up the issue of what you do when you're on a path and it suddenly says no entry. I have from at least the sense that we should defy authority, at least in the Louvre. But I suppose one needs to check whether there is a bull in the further field.
that's a good question.
Well, where I'd like to walk in next, there's a great collection of small green books that you can get at the Vieux Quimper. This doesn't apply to America. But every section of France, there are these, and they're pretty, each book covers a small section with all sorts of, you would never find them on your own walks. Amazing walks along rivers and around lakes and through hillsides and through towns and through, they're not urban, they're all rural, but I'd like to walk every single one of those books.
That sounds great. I'd like to do that. It sounds amazing. What about you, Lisa?
I feel like I'm lacking of imagination of the future. What can I say? I mean, what I'm doing right now is what's fascinating me is I'm following the old Bièvre River, which is a disappeared river on the left bank of Paris that was an industrial river for textile production from the Middle Ages to the 19th century. So I find myself walking around there a lot, trying to find it. And generally what happens is I get really sort of spaced out and confused and not exactly lost, but it's always shockingly unrewarding. My search to try to find this old river, which, you can actually follow it on your phone, but if you're just walking around. So that's the kind of walking I'm doing currently that is puzzling and peculiar. And then I just came back from the west coast of Canada where I was on 2 islands, Vancouver Island, which we call the Big Island, and Salt Spring Island, which is one of the Canadian, in the States, you call them the San Juan Islands. We call them the Gulf Islands. So so these small islands off the coast. And so I was walking in first growth forest on Salt Spring Island, which is a place I used to live in. And so my interest was in trying to find the paths that I used to walk when I was 19, 20, 21 years old. And so all my imagination had sort of was leaning forward to that experience of revisiting the forest. And yeah, I just got to do it. And I broke my wrist when I was doing it. So
I didn't realize that was also a kind of confrontation with your childhood, which makes
it wasn't my childhood. I grew up in and outside of Toronto. I lived there as a
young adult.
Yeah.
Oh, that sounds, but with your past, that there's
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
That sounds wonderful. Well, this has been wonderful, and I don't know. Does anyone else
Thank you
have
so
a
much.
final word or something? I see familiar faces, and thank you all for coming, and thank you, Cole and Lisa, for doing this. And it's been a great pleasure, and I look forward to more conversations, and I hope that we all keep in touch. But this will be they'll be now on Walk, Listen, Create, so you can contact Cole and Lisa if you have anything more to say to them. Right now, the next Walking America is projected for April, and we're going to have two novelists who that's the first time we've done novel. Well, I mean, Lisa, we had a novel, but two novelists who have new work. One is Janice Deal. Her book will be coming out in April. It's called The Blue Door, and it features a long walk of self-searching and searching for other connection. And it's published by New Door Books, who was the publisher for my anthology, Ways of Walking, as well. And the other is a writer named Sharon White, who has a book coming out in the winter called Monado Sketches, and it's about a woman also sort of self-exiled who is healing and walking in Japan shortly after, in the aftermath of the Fujiyama meltdown. So, and just so I think they're going to be a great pair again, and looking forward to that discussion too. But thank you. Thank you for your time. Thanks for everybody for coming, and see you all soon.
And say thanks to all three of you. Really lovely and entertaining discussion.